This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 380th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. The period in between outline and first draft is traditionally the research period for me. This is often a very lengthy period requiring months of steady reading. When I was researching Regency London for my historical superhero work in progress Wayfarer, which is currently in editing stages, I spent 6 months reading upwards of 50 books. So I kind of have to laugh at my research pile this time around. The joys of writing fantasy. As I prepare to dive into the first draft of my Portal Fantasy sequel, Dreambreaker, there's just one book in my research pile, and that's the first book in the series, Dreamlander. I will, of course, have various historical questions to help me maintain the Renaissance era feel of my fantasy world. But anything I don't know, I just get to make up. The biggest challenge is making sure Dreambreaker and its details are consistent with what I originally portrayed in Dreamlander. It's a ton of fun to get to revisit Dreamlander, especially since this is the first time I've read it when I knew there was yet more of its world to discover beyond its pages. Soon as I finish laboring through my tremendous research pile, it's on to the first draft from here. The latest post on the site is an easy way to notch up your scene conflict. On your way to writing truly compelling scenes, learn to look past the basics of scene structure to discover surprising complexities in your scene conflict. Consider this list of advantages and disadvantages for each, which you can find at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Most Common Writing Mistakes, Part 58, Too Much Description. Sooner or later, most writers will get their hands slapped over description, whether it's too much description or too little. The bad news is that this is a big deal in narrative fiction. Get the balance of your description wrong and it could throw off your entire story. The good news is that once you understand how to examine and execute your descriptions, you will have taken your writing to the next level. Now, I've talked previously about the problems of too little, or worse, no, description. Today we're going to examine what is perhaps the even more egregious side of this dilemma, too much description. Now, while some authors may err too far on the other side and leave the entire visual world of their stories to their subtext, others among us might err too far in the opposite direction. Not only do we give readers the descriptive details they need, we belabor the point by telling them every little last detail about the way every cranny of a setting looks, and not only how it looks today, but how it looked in years past, and maybe even how it's going to look in the future. The problem here is twofold. Number one, lengthy descriptions are almost inevitably boring. Number two, they're boring because they do not matter. Readers are very trusting and obliging people. They will follow you anywhere and listen to anything you have to say as long as there's a point. And this is true of the story in general, each scene within that story, right on down to every word choice. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. This holds true in storytelling as well. If you're reading a book and the author can't prove himself in something so small as the word choices in his descriptions, then it's highly unlikely he's going to offer mastery in the bigger picture areas of structure, arc, and theme. The reason readers instinctively understand too much description is problematic is because it signals a deeper issue within the framework of the story. Namely, too much description saps the story of subtext. Authors must find the perfect balance of telling readers just enough for the story to make sense and come to life, without sharing so much that readers are crowded right out of the story. Our goal as storytellers should be to create a partnership between our own imaginations and that of our readers. If we're describing every little detail, both pertinent and not, what we're creating instead is an on-the-nose narrative that has literally been described to death. Now, there are generally 3 reasons an author might slip into the trap of using too much description. Reason number 1, you aren't trusting readers to get it. Authors often get nervous about their abilities. They aren't sure they've chosen the right quantity or quality of telling details to bring the scene to life for readers. So they pile on more descriptors and still more. Now, overwriting is just fine in the beginning. In fact, sometimes it's helpful to purposefully overwrite to help you dig deep and find the best descriptors. But you must be wise enough and brave enough to pare back descriptions to their essence. And when in doubt, pare it back as much as you dare, and then bring in an objective reader to tell you if everything still makes sense. Reason number 2, you love your story details too much. Nobody is ever going to love your story more than you do. You love everything about it. You love the very specific pattern of wear on the protagonist's bedroom carpet. You love your sidekick's freckles so much you've counted every last one of them. You love your heroine's opulent, gorgeous, and very expansive wardrobe. Naturally, you want to share every one of these awesome sauce details with readers because of course they're going to find them just as awesome and fascinating as you do. Except, they don't. As I may have mentioned above, readers only care about stuff that matters, stuff that advances the plot, stuff that helps them understand the story and characters, stuff that fires their own imaginations without bogging things down. As Stephen King says in On Writing, write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open. In other words, once you decide to send your story out into the world for the enjoyment of readers, it doesn't belong to you anymore, and you must optimize its presentation to benefit them, not to indulge your own obsessive passion about ultimately irrelevant details. Reason number 3, you're still growing your story sensibilities. As with all of narrative storytelling, learning to create the proper balance of description is a process of experience. Even with the best of intentions, none of us ace it the first or the 30th time out of the gate. The first step in learning to refine your descriptions is to be aware they probably do need a little refining. Pay attention to them as you're writing them, and particularly as you're revising. Listen to their rhythm within the overall flow of the story. Question your word and detail choices. And when all that is done, bring in reinforcements and ask others to pay special attention to anywhere they might find your descriptions growing tedious. So, are you ready to slay your unnecessary description wherever you can find it? Good. Let's go find it. For the most part, all descriptions fall into 2 categories: setting description and character description. We're going to talk about character's description first. Here's what too much character description looks like. I shook hands with the man. He had brown hair and brown eyes. He was 6 feet tall and skinny. He wore overalls and a brown suit coat. There were patches on the elbows and the knees. He also wore a hat with a hole in it. He had a mole beside his nose. His teeth were crooked. His sister stood beside him. She had red hair and blue eyes. She was 5'3" and plump. She wore a dress and an apron, but no hat. Her teeth were also crooked. And this is what just enough character description looks like. This is an excerpt from The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Schaffer and Annie Barrows. Dossie held out his hands. I had been expecting him to look like Charles Lamb, and he does, a little. He has the same even gaze. He presented me with a bouquet of carnations from Booker, who couldn't be present. He had concussed himself during a rehearsal and was in hospital overnight for observation. Dossie is dark and wiry, and his face has a quiet, watchful look about it, until he smiles. Saving a certain sister of yours, he has the sweetest smile I've ever seen. And I remembered Amelia writing that he has a rare gift for persuasion. I can believe it. Like Eben, like everyone here, he is too thin, though you can tell he was more substantial once. His hair is going gray, and he has deep-set brown eyes, so dark they look black. The lines around his eyes make him seem to be starting a smile even when he's not, but I don't think he's over 40. He is only a little taller than I am, and limps slightly, but he's strong. Hefted all my luggage, me, Amelia, and Kit, into his wagon with no trouble. So, should you describe your character's face? In my early books, I had a serious bent for giving all of my heroines a Grecian nose. Honestly, I still have no idea what that even is, much less what it looks like. In general, faces are just plain hard to describe. Going into the details of forehead, jaw, lips, and nose takes up a ton of space and doesn't generally impart too much useful knowledge to readers. Much better to do what Anthony Ryan did in his fantasy Bloodsong, when he had one character comment briefly but tellingly on the protagonist's appearance when she said, "I'd heard you were handsome. You're not, but your face is interesting." Should you describe your character's hair color? Color is arguably the most useful of all descriptors. Hair color, for all that it is not generally an important characterizing detail, is a useful visual detail. But it's also a very small detail that should be mentioned as briefly as possible and in a way that does not jar the narrative out of its POV, which we'll talk about in just a second. Should you describe your character's eye color? Let me ask you this. Do you remember the eye color of your most recent checker at the grocery store? Me neither. In most instances, eye color is not an important visual detail. It is, however, an intimate detail. We start noticing someone's eye color when we really start paying attention to them, seeing them as an individual rather than just another person. The eyes are the windows to the soul, which means eye color only becomes important when it aids in providing that window. Should you describe your character's body? Readers rarely need to know your protagonist is 5'11.5 inches, 170 pounds. They do, however, need to have a sense of the person's build. Tall, muscular, short, plump, attractive, average, whatever. The smallest of physical descriptors can help readers imagine the right silhouette for your character. Do you need to describe your character's clothes? Sometimes clothes make the man, sometimes not. Early on in the story, and in certain important scenes later on, a specific description of your character's clothing may be important to flesh out your world and set the stage. Otherwise, follow the rule John Dufresne offered succinctly in The Lie That Tells the Truth. Dress is only important in a story when it is important to the character. And by important, he doesn't mean the character's favorite pair of Chucks ever, but rather plot advancing. Should you describe the character's scars or special features? The question you need to ask yourself is, do they matter to the story? For example, the character has a bionic arm that lets her defeat bad guys. Or do they define the character? For example, the character is deeply ashamed of his disfiguring facial birthmark. Or do they establish the setting? For example, tribal scars in a jungle setting, or green scales in an alien setting. In those cases, by all means, describe them. Otherwise, what's the point, right? And should you describe your character as seen by other characters? Perhaps the trickiest part of character description is figuring out how to describe POV characters. Your protagonist, in particular, is going to be the most important person in the story, and you want to provide readers the right visual image. But you also don't want to break POV by having the character launch into a lengthy description of herself, or just as cringeworthy, an observation of herself in a mirror. The best rule of thumb is to describe only details that matter to the character and matter in the moment. However, you can also cheat just a little. When your character scratches his hand through his hair, is he really thinking about scratching his hand through his black hair? Nah. But he is aware that his hair is black. So you can almost always get away with sneaking that little descriptor in there. No harm, no foul, and readers have a useful detail to add to their mental image. Alright, now let's talk about setting description. This is what too much setting description looks like. The man woke up. The room he was in was big, with rows and rows of beds for other patients. It was still dark, but he knew what he would see out the window. A road, then fields, then pine trees. There were 12 windows in this room, tall ones, from floor to ceiling. The curtains were white, as were the walls and the floor. 6 fans dotted the ceiling. People tossed and turned in their beds. He knew all their names, Peter in the far corner, then Jim, Bob, Andrew, then him. Beyond the room was a desk for the nurse on duty, then long hallways and still more rooms, most just like this one. And this is what just enough setting description looks like. This is an excerpt from Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. At the first gesture of morning, flies began stirring. Inman's eyes and the long wound at his neck drew them, and the sound of their wings and the touch of their feet were soon more potent than a yard full of roosters in rousing a man to wake. So he came to yet one more day in the hospital ward. He flapped flies away with his hands, and looked across the foot of his bed to an open triple-hung window. Ordinarily he could see to the red road and the oak tree and the low brick wall, and beyond them to a sweep of fields and flat piney woods that stretched to the western horizon. The view was a long one for the flatlands, the hospital having been built on the only swell within eyeshot. But it was too early yet for a vista. The window might as well have been painted gray. Now, should you describe your setting at the beginning of the book? Half the trick of setting descriptions is finding the perfect place to put the details. As always, the descriptions only matter when they matter. So, when do they matter? They matter when readers need to be able to envision the scene and when new details are pertinent to the events of the plot. And the former is a pretty broad umbrella, which will first come into play at the very beginning of the book. You will need to describe enough of your initial setting to orient readers within the scene, and just as important, to give them a sense of the overall story world, whether it's Texas or Westeros. This does not mean, however, that you need to describe every last bit of your overall setting right there at the beginning. Get readers oriented in the first scene, then start sewing additional details only as they become pertinent. For example, we have no idea what state or time Inman is in the previous excerpt until further into the first chapter. Should you describe your setting at the beginning of a scene? What about when you begin a new scene? You definitely do need to orient readers afresh after every scene or chapter break, but should you begin with a full-on description of the setting every time? Well, ask yourself this. Is the setting the most important part of this scene? If yes, definitely open with it. You may even be able to go ahead and describe it in full, depending on the scope of its importance. If not, hold back a little. Introduce the scene hook, sketch a few setting details to help readers get their boots on the ground, and then slowly dole out other pertinent descriptors as they become necessary. That is, as characters begin to interact with them. Should you describe your setting the second or third time it's entered? So what about already familiar settings? Readers have already seen your teenage protagonist's bedroom several times. Do you need to describe it afresh every time to reorient them? Nope. The only details you need for repeat scenes are the new ones. You've already given readers a mental image of this setting, which will remain fixed in their minds unless and until you need to update it. Should you describe your settings in detail? So what if you've got a huge, gorgeous, very unique setting? A mechanized city like in Philip Reeves's Mortal Engines, or an antebellum cotton plantation like in Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. Half the fun of reading about these places is getting to explore them. But that doesn't mean you can get away with pages upon pages of detailed setting description. Do share all interesting and important details with readers, but do it artfully by sewing it into the action of the plot and the development of the character, making all the details you share matter to the story, making them mean more than just words about brick and mortar. Learning the art of avoiding too much description is ultimately the art of controlling your narrative. When you're able to move past description as merely description and bring it into play as a technique for advancing plot, character, and theme through the judicious choice of telling details, you will raise the entire tenor of your book. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.